Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
I mean, how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, great, Barry, a reefer.
Hi, welcome back. It's the Koala podcast, and probably the last one of the year because everybody keeps saying to me, let's schedule for January. And I've sort of got a bit of a biggie this year at the end of the year, which is great. I've actually got my first ever politician on the podcast, which is no mean feat, I can assure you, for a small publisher. David Shoebridge from the Greens Party, who introduced a piece of legislation into the Australian Senate. It's sort of been in discussion for a long time, eventually made it onto the floor a couple of weeks ago, and was then axe chopped as quickly as possible by both the major parties, which I'm sure David isn't so naive as to think that wasn't going to happen. But the important thing is this piece of legislation got up, and why it was important is because it's talking about the thing that nobody will talk about in Australia, is that we have to have a adult use market for cannabis that works alongside a medical cannabis environment, so you actually get reality in Australia. And you also might develop a local market rather than do the standard Australian thing, which is let three people run that with certain political. And then that, you know, anybody who knows Australia knows that that happens across the board. It's not just cannabis. You can talk about any industry. It's the history of Australia. If you want to know more about that, just read Jan Morris on Sydney, and she explains that very, very clearly. David, sorry, my little spiel. Welcome to the show. Let's go back to the beginning. Why? Well, it's pretty obvious why you decided to draw up this bill, but you know, what was the thinking? There was a bill prior to this one, wasn't there?
Yeah, Sean. Well, good to be good to be speaking with you. At the end of the year, it's been a pretty rugged year, I think, for all of us looking around the world.
Well, it's not as rugged as next year's going to be.
No, I think next year's going to be pretty full on in Australia anyhow, and might be a little bit bloody odd in North America. But I'm the party's justice spokesperson, so the Greens justice spokes. I moved from state to federal politics last federal election, and I was the state's justice spokes at a state level in the state of New South Wales in Australia. And you know, in that role at a state and a federal level, getting a well-regulated public interest model for recreational cannabis has been a passion of mine. It's an incredibly long-standing policy platform from the Greens to have legalised, well-regulated adult cannabis market. And so I actually saw it as a kind of challenge, but also an opportunity to go somewhere no one had ever gone before, which was look and see if we could get a national market for adult recreational use of cannabis. And there's a whole lot of attractions about getting a national market, a single national market, which we can probably unpick in a bit. But one of the things that I thought was, and I continue to think is a real opportunity federally, is once we've got the institutional opposition from the two major parties, Labor and the Coalition, who both kind of have a South Park approach to drugs. You know, drugs are bad. That's the beginning and the end of their thinking. It's not an intellectual place, the federal parliament. There aren't the same number of institutional barriers at a federal level that there are at a state level politically. We don't have really puffed up police unions at a federal level. We're not quite as vulnerable to the individual sort of talkback radio shock.
Although, I mean, the AFP seem to be pretty proactive on I'm busting drugs all 2024, haven't they? There seems to be an uptick in their activity in that area. I mean, is there a reason?
Well, I mean, there's an interesting. We could probably have a different interview on the policing dynamic at the moment. There's a lot of tension between the Australian Federal Police, who try and pride themselves as some sort of elite police force, but they're absolutely not. I mean, they're a relatively shallow talent pool at a federal level, and their principal job is meant to be kind of like cross-border crime, transnational crime, drug importation, that kind of high-level national sort of criminal investigations. And so, but in order to do that, they often have to work closely with state and territory police forces, but particularly state police forces like the New South Wales Police and the Victorian Police. And there is a huge amount of tension at the moment, actually, between the federal police and the state police, and it's largely related to some of those highly publicised drug busts that the Australian Federal Police have done. The Australian Federal Police like to interdict a large drug bust at the border, seize the drugs, lay the drugs out in a media-friendly format, get a few AFP uniforms out the front of the drug bust, invite their chosen media crew in and say, look at this, we got $200 million worth of methamphetamines. Look at this, we got 320.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the same story for the last 50
and they
years.
just churn that media story.
It's churning content, basically.
Yeah, and state police who often have been tracking this same shipment with their contacts, state police, and they've often sometimes been working together with the Australian Federal Police. State police get increasingly shitty about that because the state police are keen. They don't want the photo opportunity and the drug seizure at the border. They realise that, you seize one load of drugs and because there's all that happens is the next load of drugs find their way through because, you can lose 5 or 6 and still run a profit if you're importing into the Australian market for most of these drugs. And the state police want to actually let the drugs enter into the jurisdiction, follow it through, and then dismantle the network that's in Australia distributing the drugs. And time after time after time, the AFP go, we want our media shot. We want to seize the drugs. We want to do this. No, it makes no structural change to the drug market in Australia, but it gives the AFP a bunch of media exposure. It makes the federal attorney general feel good. And that's got to such an extent that there's actually at different times there's been a refusal to share police information between the states and the feds, a refusal to process federal proceeds of crime applications because they are just sick of it at a state level. So yes, you're
we could spend 5 hours speaking about the politics of policing in Australia. So I mean, let's move back. Let's move back to the bill, shall we?
Yeah. So I don't think the AFP have anything at a federal level. They don't have anything like the political clout that state police have at a state level. They just don't. I mean, they have a small amount of political clout, but it's very modest compared to a state level. So for me, this was an opportunity to try and get outside of that kind of law and order politics and actually have a look at the substance of the existing market. Like there's a very large national cannabis market that's already out there. It's being regulated at the moment by organised crime and bikies. And I don't know about you, Sean, but I don't think they're great regulators. I don't think they have a huge public interest behind their process. Quality control.
Definitely not. Definitely not. It's those ones in the illegal market who are controlling it, whereas the people, the people who have been doing it for 50 years in northern New South Wales they don't get involved in the conversation, and they're being pushed out by the medical side of things, or have been pushed out. So I presume you agree with me on the fact that to bring the right people together, adult use is really, along with medical use, is really the only solution.
Yeah, and they're two distinct markets, right? One is for recreational use and one is for medicinal use. They should be seen as quite distinct markets, regulated as separate markets. And so our bill was designed to hopefully break with that great Australian tradition you spoke of, which is you have like an oligopoly of 3 or 4 trusted suppliers and producers or importers who all got good political connections, and they control the market. They restrict price and supply to such a level that they get supernormal profits and everybody ends up paying. That's what we wanted not to do. So but
we're already pretty well down that path, aren't we?
Well, we're down that path partly in the medicinal market, and we might want to talk about, I found there are some good medicinal cannabis suppliers in Australia who are really kind of genuinely interested in the market, and they kind of see a kind of natural affinity with a regulated adult use recreational market. So there are some good players, and I don't want to paint the whole industry the same, but there's a bunch of people in the medicinal market who see a well-regulated recreational market as a threat to their current business model, because their current business model, as you know, has been to have a massive expansion of the medicinal cannabis market, retain high prices, retain control, and expand into a kind of quasi-recreational market by giving anyone a prescription who comes in and talking about their mild anxiety or their mild sleep disorder. And that's clearly been part of their model. And we've seen a massive expansion of the medicinal market from people who are willing to go through that process or willing to pay the high prices and
well,
get
it's
a product.
interesting because I was just recently in Australia and talking to friends, colleagues, and family. I noticed now that they're pricing it down, some of them, so it's just under the black market price.
Yeah, but for a product that's meant to be medicinal, I mean, maybe there has been an explosion of men aged 25 to 45 who are having anxiety and sleep disorders in Australia. Maybe that is an explosion. Or that could
they
be.
always had it.
There could be
They just didn't know what it was.
For why that demographic is suddenly getting a whole lot of access to medicinal cannabis. There might be another explanation.
Exactly right.
So we see that market doesn't seem to be responding the way you'd want it to respond if it's purely medicinal. Doesn't seem to be delivering recreational cannabis in a way that you'd want recreational cannabis being delivered. You don't abuse a medical model in order to deliver a recreational product. Exactly. That's got a long history of not working. So our model was designed to really focus on small growers, focus on regional jobs. Our model wanted to give priority access to the growing part of it to community cooperatives rather than corporates. It prohibited big alcohol, big tobacco, and big pharma from having any role in the industry. We just didn't want it taken over by,
So essentially, you've taken a sensible approach of it's an agricultural product. Australia is good at agricultural products. Let's think of it in that as that form.
And then to get a hope, I mean, you don't have to be a small scale producer, but the model was designed to encourage small scale producers, encourage sort of regional jobs, regional growth, and then to have quite strict limits on online advertising, have the primary delivery model, the primary retail model being through dispensaries and cannabis cafes, which would be given a license.
Owned or
privately owned. Privately owned.
So not like a German approach that's quite quasi-private, quasi-government.
Yeah, I mean, we want these places to be kind of fun, a little bit exciting.
God forbid.
Creative spaces. I don't really want it to look like a Service New South Wales office. I think cannabis cafes should be actually kind of fun.
That would drive people away, wouldn't it?
They don't need to look like a teacher's common room. They can be really nice places and kind of places people want to go as an alternative. It put in place it was proposed a new national regulator, the Cannabis Australia National Authority, and that regulator had an obligation to regulate in the public interest, was not going to be industry owned and controlled.
And would that be a subset of another department, or would that be a department standing on its own?
It'd be its own statutory authority, just an independent statutory authority, and established as an independent statutory authority, reporting to the health minister. Now, I mean, maybe that was the right call, maybe it's the wrong call. Maybe you could report to the industry minister. We had an open mind.
That's the devil in the detail, isn't it?
Yeah, so I don't want to get lost in the weeds on that. And it was proposing. The bill itself didn't contain a 15% sales tax on cannabis because of complicated constitutional reasons. I was introducing it in the Senate. But the model was proposing a 15% cannabis sales tax. And we got that modelled on what that would mean in terms of revenue and price, because those two things are super connected. You look at the Canadian experience, you look at the US experience, you've got to look at revenue and price. The Parliamentary Budget Office crunched the numbers on it, and their view was that if we put a 15% cannabis sales tax on top of 10% GST, so you've got like a 25% Commonwealth tax take, the bulk of the GST will go to states, and the whole of the sales tax will go to the Commonwealth. You get about $30 billion in public revenue over the first decade of use, and based on international experience, you would expect the retail price in the recreational market to halve over the first. So the actual consumer price would halve over the first decade, and you get about $30 billion worth of public revenue. We had a bunch of people say, oh, but if you tax it, it'll just be encouraging the black market. And the answer is no. The international experience
the answer
says,
is sensible taxation. So you take the Pacific Northwest approach, not the Californian approach. It's, I mean, Australia has all these examples to work from around the world.
Which was what we looked at. We realized that if you put a whacking great tax on it, you are just going to retain the black market with a significant play, and you're going to just put all these barriers in place for good operators. We also, and I think we got that right. I mean, I'm happy to have the debate, but I think we got that about right. And the number crunching we got from the PBO suggests we got it about right. And the last thing the last two things I'll say were the core parts of the bill was for those cannabis dispensaries and cannabis cafes, at the point of sale, there was a requirement for anybody involved in the sales process to have a responsible service of cannabis certification, the credentials for which would be controlled by the national regulator. And we wanted to sort of get ahead of where the alcohol industry has got, and a prohibition on alcohol being sold at the same premises.
Well, I was going to ask that question without getting into too much detail, but in essence, you're creating an education industry around cannabis by default, which is exactly what cannabis needs.
Yeah, and for the information and for the training for the responsible service of cannabis to not be industry controlled, but to be controlled by a national regulator using, developing best evidence about strains, about vulnerabilities, about, people's medical history, like taking through all of those things. So you actually have from the outset a responsible industry, not a bunch of sort of some of the US experience has been very much laissez-faire, let it go. We didn't want to repeat those mistakes. And finally, the bill permitted people to grow up to 6 cannabis plants at home, and it, per household, provided you have an adult in the household, up to 6 cannabis plants. You could have 20 adults in the household or 1 adult with 6 plants. We went on a consultation process with this bill. We put our draft bill out for consultation, asked questions about all the key elements. We actually got about 9,000 responses to our online consultation. And then this will surprise you, Sean. We read the responses. It was quite a project for the office. We reviewed the responses, and then we changed our draft bill as a response to it and actually listened to the consultation. And I think the one thing we eventually introduced in Parliament was a good national market. And by making it a national market, you can have a national sales tax. That's great for the political sell. Giving politicians public revenue to spend on other stuff makes them excited. You also get a kind of coherent national market. You don't have a kind of New South Wales market establishing, and then you've got issues about sales across border between New South Wales and Victoria. You have what you have in the US if you're not careful, that the money generated in a state can't be deposited in a federally registered financial institution.
I've just been writing about that this morning.
All that mess. You get rid of all that mess by having a well-regulated national market. So we thought the time had come. The model I thought was pretty good, but you know how it is. Politics got in the way. The Labor Party and the coalition,
But I presume you're not, as I said,
little bits in the bill.
In my introduction, you're not naive enough to know that they would stomp is a good Australian word, but they would basically naysay it. So I suppose my initial question is, the process has started. How does it carry on?
Yeah, and that is a good question. We wanted to show it could be done. We wanted to show you can do a national model. You've got an achievable structure, something we can get people to rally around and hopefully campaign for over the medium and longer term. And we wanted to have it pretty much in place so that we've got a federal election coming up, Sean, and it's going to come up pretty bloody soon in the first half of 2025, probably April, maybe May. It's very likely.
Will you be running the bill as a major part of the Green Party's manifesto for the next election?
It is. Well, I mean, I'm not going to preempt our election announcements, but if you don't find legalized, a legal recreational cannabis market as part of our election platform, then
you're not in the party anymore.
I'm not a Green senator talking to you from Sydney today. Because I mean, why wouldn't you? Because if for no other reason, you put it in your platform and suddenly you've got an extra $30 billion to play with, which you can, build houses and schools and good stuff with. I mean, why wouldn't you include legalizing cannabis in your platform if you could? So assume it goes in the platform, then it's in the mix, you see, in a minority government scenario. If neither the Labor Party or the coalition have a majority, then we're in a position of significantly more political power, and there are different things you can force onto the agenda if neither party has a majority in either house. And I think people call it a minority parliament. I call it actually a working parliament, where you can get the kind of generational reform through that otherwise, can take decades.
So, that sort of leads to my next question, because they have all been voted in on only state on preferential votes, but there is a sort of rise in the vote for the Australian and various state cannabis parties, which some could perceive as taking away from some of your vote, because you're both working on, you might not think exactly the same. And to be honest, I think you guys have a more holistic view. They're bogged down in they're being bogged down by the major parties in the detail to string them out. My favorite topic is driving on this one. That could go on for the next.
And then what's happening in Victoria on driving?
Yeah, I know. Well, it's classic. It's classic Australian state politics to string them out, and hopefully they're out at the next state election. But do you see any way that you guys are going down the same track and you can have discussions that widen the conversation and educate the electorate?
Well, we will work with whoever will support us to get through a national recreational cannabis market. Not just any market. Obviously we don't want one that is absolutely controlled by big pharma or big tobacco or big alcohol. We think that would be a mistake. But we will work with whoever it takes to get that through. So if the electorate throws one of their MPs into the mix, we'll absolutely work with them. And I've shared my bill and my draft bill, shared some of the research with some of those state MPs when they've asked for it, and I'm very happy to do that and have a discussion with them. I do think, though, if you want to get this kind of reform through, the idea that you can just deal with it narrowly on its own merits in politics, that's just not how politics works, right? It's going to be part of a more complex, broader mix of politics where you say, okay, well, if you want that, all right, we're happy to work with you on that. But here's a couple of things we want as well. And you're going to have sufficient political heft to be able to deliver on those kinds of complex political push and shove. So our plan is to get, enough Greens senators and lower house MPs elected to have that kind of political heft. And because, I would love to say that politics is just, you make the best case, you present the best evidence, you have a really sensible solution, you put it on the table, and who could resist it? I wish that was how politics works, but I've got to say it's just not, because you have these institutional opposition from the Labor Party and the coalition, who, even if it's a great idea, wouldn't want it to not be their idea, and therefore squash ideas that don't come from within them. And they're so absolutely hamstrung by their own vested interests that they're delivering to, whether it's the alcohol industry or the pharmaceutical industry or it's the police. They're so trapped by those vested interests, they can't put the creative idea on the table. So we've got to find ways to... And
look, that's been the story for the last 15 years in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
How do we flip
minority parliament?
I know you're in the process of flipping it, but how it to me, following it daily for 10 years now, it just seems I am lost for words on how to flip it.
You've got to change the structures, the structural politics have to change. If it's just Tweedledum and Tweedledee switching, sharing the trophy every 3 months, every 3 years, handing it back slightly more dented, if that's not going to change anything. Like, they're not going to change anything. We need to disempower those. We need to remove the idea that they are solely responsible for policy for some sort of binary policy decision between the Labor Party and the coalition. We actually need to break that down and say, well, actually, we're going to have a much more fluid parliament that might actually be willing to open its ears up to novel ideas.
Okay, so here's a very Australian question, and I apologise to American listeners on this. The rise of the Teals, who sort of are either ex-liberals, which we call are conservatives in Australia, and ex-Labor, who are Democrats, sort of. I mean, they were the big chunk independent elected last time round. What's their thinking on this issue?
Well, I mean, they some of them have very conservative tendencies. I mean, I think one of the things that disappointed me about the bill and the vote on the bill was that a kind of teal independent in the Senate, who people, kind of regard as socially progressive, and I mean, I like the guy. He's largely good. He wouldn't want me to praise him too much. He'd like to have his own independent existence. But David Pocock, a kind of teal senator from the ACT, he's his own independent person. He's not a cookie cutter teal in any way. I don't want to present that. As I said, I have regard for the guy, but he abstained from the vote. Like, he didn't support it, and the argument he used to me was, he was concerned that this was overriding territory laws, and the Commonwealth shouldn't override territory laws. It's sort of territory rights thing, which is, I'll be quite frank, that's a bullshit argument. The Commonwealth every day.
Well, I was going to say, it's using a bit of law school constitutional law to sort of fudge out reality. Yes,
it's the nature of our constitution. When the Commonwealth passes laws, it overrides any contrary state or territory laws, and you need that kind of. You need some kind of solution of that conflict of laws, and I thought that was, that was quite a frustrating sign, because I think for some of the Teals, they come from that kind of, they tend to come from wealthier parts of Australia, more privileged parts of my hometown of Sydney or Melbourne, and I think they don't want to frighten off their kind of conservative, wealthy electoral base, and they think that maybe cannabis law reform, that might be a bunch of hippies in combis, and that's kind of not our look. We're much schmicker than that. I think there's a number of problems with that. First of all, you have an obligation, I think, to listen to the evidence, and in Australia, for example, to stop 60,000 people a year, largely from marginal and poorer communities, being ground through the bloody criminal justice system because they're found with a joint in their pocket or a little bag of weed. I think we have an obligation to do that. Doesn't matter which electorate you serve, to fix that up. But also, more fundamentally, I think they miss what the modern cannabis market is. Like, I
would imagine a lot of their electorate, especially the male side of their electorate who go to work every day in certain types of jobs, are fully aware of what the cannabis market is. That's
that's absolutely right. But also, I mean, what I think is really interesting is the cannabis market in an illegal market like Australia tends to have a lot more of the kind of traditional consumption patterns, lots more smoking, and cannabis market in a well-regulated legal market ends up looking really different, with drinks and edibles and a very different kind of vibe and feel, much more in the sort of, if you want to put it that way, in the mold of a kind of teal electorate. And I think that they don't, because they don't really, they're not exposed to the kind of discussion, the debate, they don't really understand that a well-regulated legal market would look bloody nice on a privileged part of the northern beaches in Sydney, a nice cannabis cafe or a dispensary. It's not.
As they said when Colorado opened up, the sky is not going to fall in. And another thing I've been reporting on this week is just more than one. I think 3 studies this week have just said an ever declining adolescent use of cannabis in the US and Canadian market.